Picture this. It's years after your gallbladder surgery, and you're at a family dinner, sitting in front of a plate of something rich, a creamy pasta, a slice of prime rib, whatever your particular weakness happens to be. Nobody warned you to think twice about this. Everyone told you the exact same thing before you ever went into that operating room. Once it's out, it's out. Problem solved. Eat whatever you want. And then, 40 minutes later, you're doubled over with cramping, or making an unplanned trip to the bathroom, or feeling that same strange tightness under your right ribs you thought was gone for good. Here's the part almost nobody explains to you before that surgery. Years later, the actual tube carrying bile from your liver into your intestine can physically change shape. It can widen. Your body, quietly, on its own, starts trying to build a small reservoir out of a pipe that was never designed to be one. That's not a metaphor for something else. That's something a radiologist can measure on an ultrasound, in millimeters. This isn't going to be another video telling you to try a liver flush or drink something green every morning. This is the real, physical chain of events happening inside your body in the months and years after that organ comes out, mechanism by mechanism. So that by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why rich food can feel different a decade later, what your liver, your gut bacteria, and even your bone density have to do with an organ you no longer have, and what you can actually do about all of it. Let's start with what the gallbladder actually did, because almost everyone gets one detail wrong here, and that detail changes how you understand everything that follows. The gallbladder never made bile, not one drop of it. Your liver makes bile, continuously, all day and all night, whether you're eating or not. Picture your liver as a factory that simply never shuts off. The gallbladder's entire job was something different: storage and concentration. It sat there like a small reservoir, taking that liver-made bile and packing it down, pulling water out of it until it was 5 to 10 times stronger than what came straight from the liver. Then, the moment fat showed up in your gut, a hormone called cholecystectomy told the gallbladder to squeeze hard and fire off a concentrated shot of bile exactly when it was needed. So here's the entire relationship in one sentence: a steady, low-grade trickle from the liver versus a timed, concentrated burst from the gallbladder. Picture a water balloon tied to the end of a garden hose. The hose runs constantly, a slow, steady drip. Squeeze the balloon, though, and you get a strong, sudden burst of water exactly when you need it. Take the balloon away, and all that's left is the hose, still running, whether you need it or not. Here's the part that explains almost everything else in this video, so stay with me. After the gallbladder comes out, your liver doesn't slow down, and it doesn't know the balloon is gone. It keeps producing roughly the same half-liter to a liter of bile a day it always did. What's different is the pattern of delivery. That bile now runs from the liver, down the bile duct, toward your small intestine in a thinner, more continuous stream, instead of being stored, concentrated, and released in one timed burst. So the total amount of bile your body makes barely changes at all. What changes is the shape of the supply. You've traded a burst for something much closer to a drip. And that one mismatch between when fat actually shows up in your gut and when concentrated bile is available to meet it is the single thread running through nearly everything you're about to learn. Before we go further, there's one more piece of basic plumbing you need, and it's something most people never hear explained, even by their own doctor. Bile acids are recycled, not single-use. After bile finishes breaking down fat in your small intestine, roughly 95% of those bile acids get actively reabsorbed near the very end of the small intestine, in a stretch of tissue called the terminal ileum, and shipped straight back to the liver through a dedicated vessel called the portal vein. This loop is called enterohepatic circulation, and it means your liver isn't manufacturing a fresh batch of bile acids from raw materials every single day. It's mostly recycling the same modest pool, cycling it through your gut and back again 4 to 12 times a day. Only the small fraction that doesn't get reabsorbed, roughly 5%, needs to be replaced with newly made bile acid. Hold on to that number, because it's about to explain something that seems to contradict everything I just told you about a constant drip. Here's the contradiction, and it's actually good news, at least partly. Researchers tracking bile acid levels after cholecystectomy have found that the rhythm of bile secretion, faster during digestion, slower between meals, doesn't completely disappear just because the gallbladder is gone. When there's no gallbladder to store bile, the upper part of your small intestine ends up doing a rough, improvised version of the same job. Bile acids pool there between meals, and when food arrives, intestinal contractions push that pooled bile along toward the rest of the gut. It's not concentrated the way gallbladder-stored bile was, and it's not triggered by the same clean hormonal signal, but it isn't a perfectly flat, featureless drip either. Think of it less like the balloon disappearing entirely, and more like someone using a kink in the hose as a makeshift, leaky substitute for a reservoir. It helps a little. It's nowhere near as good as the real thing. And that nowhere near as good is where a second, slower adaptation comes in, one that takes months or years rather than minutes. Surgeons and radiologists have known for decades that something happens to the common bile duct, the main pipe carrying bile toward your intestine after a cholecystectomy. Multiple ultrasound and CT studies, starting with imaging research published in the American Journal of Roentgenology back in the 1990s, and continuing through newer studies in recent years, have measured that duct before surgery and then again months or years afterward. In a meaningful share of patients, it gets a little wider. Not dramatically. In most of these studies, we're talking about the rough difference between a strand of spaghetti and a strand of fettuccine, a millimeter or two on average, sometimes more in certain studies. Some researchers describe this as the duct compensating, slowly stretching to hold a bit more bile at once, as if it's making a low-effort attempt at rebuilding a small version of the reservoir that used to sit beside it. I want to be honest about the size of this effect, because it would be easy to make it sound more dramatic than it actually is. This is a modest anatomical shift, not a new organ regenerating. And to complicate the picture further, researchers have also found that the bile duct widens naturally with age anyway, gallbladder or no gallbladder, with some studies estimating roughly a millimeter every decade, which makes it genuinely difficult to know how much of any one person's duct widening is compensation and how much is simply getting older. That's honest uncertainty, not a dodge. Even the specialists studying this don't have one clean, universally agreed number. But here's a moment worth sitting with. Even inside that uncertainty, something remarkable is happening. Twice over, in two different ways, on two different timelines, a passive system whose only original job was carrying fluid from point A to point B is trying to rebuild storage capacity it lost. That's your body doing exactly what your body always does when something gets taken away from it. Not shrugging, not freezing in place, but quietly adapting with whatever tissue it has left. The catch, both times, is that a slightly backed up intestine and a slightly wider duct are still just a length of pipe. They can hold a little more volume. Neither one can squeeze on command the way a gallbladder could. It's less like rebuilding the balloon and more like ending up with a slightly wider, slightly kinked hose. Better than nothing, not the same thing. Now, why would a weaker, steadier flow of bile matter if the total volume your liver makes barely changes? This is basic chemistry, and it's simpler than it sounds. Bile salts work by surrounding tiny droplets of fat and breaking them down into much smaller particles called micelles, small enough to slip through the watery lining of your gut and actually get absorbed. Think about cutting through grease in a sink using dish soap. A concentrated squirt straight onto a greasy pan cuts through it fast. Water that same soap down until it's thin and weak, and you could pour the whole bottle in and still watch grease sit right there on the surface. Bile salts have what chemists call a critical micellar concentration, a minimum strength they need to reach before they can efficiently start forming those fat-carrying micelles at all. Physiologists have actually measured this threshold directly. Inside the gut during digestion, bile acid concentration normally runs several times higher than the minimum needed for micelles to form, which is exactly the safety margin a concentrated, gallbladder-timed burst is built to provide. A thinner flow of bile has far less of that margin to spare, especially the moment a large, fatty meal arrives all at once and floods the system. That's not a guess or an approximation. It's the same basic physical chemistry that applies to any detergent, and bile salts are, chemically, a detergent. So here's the part most people never connect to their own experience. If a big, greasy meal, fried food, a heavy cream sauce, a large ice cream sundae, feels different now than it used to, more urgent, more uncomfortable, sending you looking for a bathroom within the hour instead of just settling in comfortably, you're not imagining that, and you're not being overly sensitive for no reason. You're running into a real, measurable timing mismatch between fat arriving and bile being concentrated enough to actually handle it. And here's where a lot of people get genuinely confused years after their surgery. They still feel occasional fullness or a dull ache under the right rib cage and think, that's impossible. I don't even have a gallbladder anymore. But you still have the rest of the plumbing. The liver, the bile ducts, and a small muscular valve called the sphincter of Oddi are all still there, still capable of getting congested, still capable of producing thickened, sludgy bile, still capable of causing that same referred discomfort, even with the original organ completely gone. Removing the gallbladder took out the balloon. It didn't touch anything else in the system. Let's follow this mismatch further down the chain into something almost nobody connects to gallbladder surgery at all: bone health. Stay with me, because the link is more direct than it sounds. We already established that bile concentration affects fat absorption, and vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin, meaning it hitches a ride inside those same fat-carrying micelles we just talked about. If bile is weaker and less concentrated, on average, absorption of fat-soluble vitamins, including vitamin D, can take a real hit. This isn't speculation. A large prospective study using data from the UK Biobank found that people who'd had a cholecystectomy carried a higher risk of developing osteoporosis later in life, and that risk showed up independent of their measured vitamin D levels, which suggests more than one pathway might be involved. A separate study, looking specifically at postmenopausal women, found that those with a prior cholecystectomy had measurably lower vitamin D levels and lower bone mineral density in both the lumbar spine and the femur, compared with women who still had their gallbladder. Now, I want to be fair to the actual science here, because this is exactly the kind of claim that gets exaggerated the moment it hits the internet. Not every study agrees. A separate nationwide cohort study looking at this same question found no overall increase in osteoporosis risk after cholecystectomy, once other contributing factors were accounted for. So the honest summary is this: there's a real, biologically plausible mechanism connecting bile concentration, fat-soluble vitamin absorption, and bone health. Several solid studies support a measurable association, and at the same time, the picture isn't unanimous across every dataset. That's not a weakness in the research. That's what real, still developing science usually looks like. And that matters more here than it might in a younger audience, because people in their 50s, 60s, and beyond are already the exact group where bone density needs defending on its own, gallbladder or not. A partial, mechanistic reason why some post-cholecystectomy patients run a little lower on vitamin D than expected isn't something to panic over. It's something worth actually checking, which we'll come back to shortly. Let's keep moving deeper, because bile isn't only about fat and vitamins, and this next part genuinely surprises even people who've read a fair amount about digestion. Bile acids aren't just detergent molecules. They also function as signaling chemicals, closer to hormones than soap. They bind to specific receptors in your gut and liver called FXR and TGR5, and through those receptors, bile acids help regulate blood sugar handling, fat storage, inflammation, and communication with the trillions of bacteria living in your intestines. Researchers, including Anita Wallstrom and Frederick Bacht, publishing this line of research in the journal Cell Metabolism, have mapped out how bile acids and gut bacteria essentially hold a two-way conversation. Your gut bacteria chemically modify bile acids as they pass through, and those modified bile acids then switch genes on and off in your gut lining and your liver. So when you change the timing and concentration of bile delivery, which is exactly what happens after a cholecystectomy, you're not only changing digestion, you're changing a signal that your gut bacteria and your gut lining were both built to expect on a schedule. And that signaling role connects to something else bile does that almost never gets mentioned. It's antimicrobial. Bile acids help keep the upper part of your small intestine from being overrun by bacteria that normally belong further down in the colon. So researchers have specifically asked the obvious question: does changing bile's timing and antimicrobial exposure after gallbladder removal affect bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine, a condition called SIBO? Here's where honest science gets genuinely messy. One study out of Korea, using a breath test to detect bacterial overgrowth, found that post-cholecystectomy patients tested positive for SIBO nearly half the time, compared with only about 13% of healthy people who still had their gallbladder, a striking difference. But a separate American study, also using breath testing, found close to the opposite result. Patients who'd had a cholecystectomy actually tested positive for SIBO less often than those who hadn't, and the researchers described the surgery as potentially protective rather than harmful. Two legitimate studies, opposite conclusions. I'm telling you both because that's the honest state of this specific question right now. Not settled, genuinely contested, and a reminder that a plausible mechanism, bile is antimicrobial, timing changes after surgery, doesn't automatically tell you which direction the real-world effect goes until someone actually measures it carefully. Real science includes contradictions like this far more often than clean, tidy narratives suggest. Let's follow a cleaner, better established thread instead: chronic loose stools or diarrhea, one of the most common and most under-discussed complaints after gallbladder removal, sometimes starting right after surgery, sometimes not showing up for months. Remember that recycling loop we talked about earlier? The one reclaiming roughly 95% of bile acids in the terminal ileum and shipping them back to the liver? This is exactly where that loop becomes the whole story. In some people, more bile acids than normal slip past that recovery point and spill into the colon, where they run into gut bacteria and colon cells that were never built to handle that volume. Researchers have pinned down a fairly specific mechanism behind what happens next. Those excess bile acids appear to directly stimulate colon cells to release more serotonin, and that extra serotonin speeds up gut motility, meaning everything moves through faster than it should. This has an actual medical name: bile acid diarrhea, often shortened to BAD in the research literature, and it's a specific, diagnosable condition, not vague sensitivity. A British gastroenterologist named Julian Walters has published extensively on this exact condition, including its connection to a gut hormone called FGF19, which normally acts as a brake on that recycling loop, telling the liver to slow bile acid production once enough is already circulating. In people with bile acid diarrhea, that brake often isn't working the way it should, so bile acid production and delivery stays too high for the colon to comfortably absorb the overflow. Here's the part that should honestly frustrate you a little, the same way it frustrates a lot of gastroenterologists. This condition is dramatically underdiagnosed. A multi-center audit across 5 major hospitals looked at more than 9,000 cholecystectomy patients and found that only about 2% were ever formally tested for bile acid diarrhea using a specific diagnostic tool called the CECAT test. Of that small group who actually got tested, well over 60% came back positive. Other studies, looking simply at reported symptoms rather than formal testing, have found diarrhea rates after cholecystectomy ranging anywhere from a small minority of patients up to more than half, depending entirely on how loosely or strictly each study defined it. I want to be straightforward about why that range is so wide. It isn't one clean number because most people experiencing this are never properly tested in the first place, so the true prevalence is genuinely uncertain, almost certainly higher than the 2% who receive a formal diagnosis, but we don't have one precise, agreed-upon figure. What we do know for certain is that it's treatable. There are real prescription medications called bile acid sequestrants that work by binding excess bile acids in the gut so they can't reach the colon and trigger that serotonin-driven urgency. This isn't a fringe theory. It's standard, mainstream gastroenterology, and it explains why some people spend years assuming they just have a sensitive stomach now, when what they actually have is a named, treatable condition nobody ever tested them for. Let's follow the chain one step further, because bile's influence doesn't stop at the colon. It loops back to the liver, and this is where things get relevant to something a lot of people never expect to hear connected to gallbladder surgery: fatty liver disease. Here's the mechanism. Researchers studying mice found that after cholecystectomy, the liver's production of triglycerides and a fat transport particle called VLDL, very low-density lipoprotein, actually increased. That sounds backward if you're only thinking of bile as something that helps digest fat you eat, but bile acids also help regulate how your own liver manages the fat already stored inside it, partly through those same FXR and TGR5 signals we just discussed. In humans, several large studies back this up. Data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey in the United States found that people who'd had a cholecystectomy had a meaningfully higher rate of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, with the overall size of that effect roughly comparable to having central obesity as a risk factor, smaller than the effect of insulin resistance, but real and measurable. And again, in the interest of not overselling this, a separate Dutch population study found that same raw association in the data, but once researchers statistically adjusted for other metabolic factors like body weight and blood sugar, cholecystectomy on its own stopped being an independent predictor. So the honest summary is this. Cholecystectomy shows up correlated with fatty liver risk across multiple large data sets. There's a plausible, tested biological mechanism behind it involving disrupted bile signaling, and it very likely interacts with, rather than acts completely apart from, whatever metabolic risk factors someone already has. Now here's a genuinely new piece. Almost nobody connects to any of this, and it's where our chain finally arrives somewhere unexpected: a nutrient called choline. Stay with me, because this ties directly back to that liver fat finding we just covered. Your liver needs a molecule called phosphatidylcholine to package fat into those VLDL particles and ship it safely out of the liver instead of letting it build up there. And phosphatidylcholine requires choline. A nutrition scientist named Stephen Zeisel, who has spent decades on this exact question at the University of North Carolina's Nutrition Research Institute, has shown that when people don't get enough dietary choline, fat starts accumulating in the liver, a diet-induced fatty liver you can produce experimentally through choline restriction alone, no other cause required. Here's where this gets specifically relevant to a lot of people listening right now. Your body can also manufacture a portion of its own choline internally through a pathway built around an enzyme called PEMT, and that enzyme is switched on by estrogen. Zeisel's research team identified a common genetic variation in the PEMT gene, and in one of their studies, close to a fifth of participants carried 2 copies of a variant that weakens this internal production pathway, with roughly another half carrying a single copy. On top of that, after menopause, estrogen drops, which further reduces how much choline the body can manufacture on its own. Put those two things together, a common genetic variation plus a natural hormonal shift, and you get a specific, identifiable group running a higher risk of a functional choline gap: postmenopausal women, which happens to overlap heavily with exactly who is statistically more likely to have needed a cholecystectomy in the first place, since excess estrogen and pregnancy are established risk factors for gallstones. It isn't that gallbladder removal directly causes a choline problem. It's that the same hormonal biology making gallstones more likely in that group can also make covering your body's own choline needs a little harder, right at a time when, as we just covered, your liver may already be handling more fat export duty than it used to. That's a genuinely new thread, and it's worth pausing on, because this is the layer almost nobody puts together. Bile timing changes fat absorption. Fat absorption issues connect to how hard your liver has to work exporting fat, and exporting fat depends on a nutrient that one specific hormonal group is already more likely to run short on. These aren't separate, unrelated facts scattered across different corners of medicine. They're one continuous chain, and you've just walked the entire length of it, from a missing balloon on a garden hose all the way to a gene switch controlled by estrogen. So let's talk about what you can actually do with all of this, because understanding a mechanism only matters if it changes what you do next. And every single one of these ties directly back to something we just covered. Nothing generic, Nothing you'd hear in a random wellness video that has nothing to do with your actual anatomy. First, change the shape of your meals, not necessarily the total fat across your day. Since bile delivery is now a continuous, dilute flow instead of a concentrated, on-demand burst, one very large, very fatty meal is exactly the scenario that overwhelms the system. You're asking a garden hose to do a fire hose's job all at once. Spreading fat across smaller, more moderate portions through the day gives that steady flow a real chance to keep up, rather than dropping below the critical concentration we talked about and letting fat pass through only partly digested. Second, lean on soluble fiber, specifically the kind that binds bile acids in roughly the same way prescription bile acid sequestrant medication does, just more gently. Oats, psyllium, apples eaten with the peel on, and legumes all contain soluble fiber that binds excess bile acids in the gut, which can meaningfully reduce the urgency and looseness we talked about with bile acid diarrhea. This isn't a substitute for a proper diagnosis if symptoms are severe or ongoing, but it's a genuinely mechanism-matched, low-risk first step built on the same underlying principle your gastroenterologist would reach for, just coming from food instead of a prescription pad. Third, if you're years out from surgery and still dealing with persistent loose stools, or on the opposite end, ongoing constipation with pale, floating stool, don't quietly file that under something you just live with now. Bring it up by name with your doctor. Ask specifically about bile acid diarrhea and whether a CAT test, where available, or a simple trial of a bile acid binding medication makes sense for you. We now know this condition is dramatically underdiagnosed, and it is genuinely treatable once someone actually identifies it. So silently adjusting your whole life around a bathroom you don't trust isn't the only option on the table. Fourth, and this one ties two different threads together. If you're a postmenopausal woman who's had your gallbladder removed, it's worth asking your doctor to include a vitamin D check in your regular blood work, especially if bone health already runs in your family. Given what we now understand about reduced fat-soluble vitamin absorption, plus the separate, overlapping choline vulnerability tied to lower estrogen, that request isn't paranoia. It's testing a specific, biologically grounded hypothesis about your own body instead of just guessing and hoping for the best. Let's go back to that dinner table for a second. You're not imagining the discomfort. You're not broken, and you're certainly not too sensitive to rich food, the way it might feel in the moment. What's actually happening is that one very specific, very traceable piece of internal plumbing lost its reservoir years ago, and nearly everything you've felt since then, the timing, the urgency, the occasional ache under your right ribs, even things as seemingly unrelated as a bone density scan or a liver ultrasound, traces back to that same single change. A burst replaced by something much closer to a drip. Your body didn't quietly accept that and move on. It's been adapting this whole time, backing bile up in the small intestine as a stopgap, gradually widening a duct here, shifting gut bacteria there, asking your liver to take on export work it didn't used to carry alone. None of that is a malfunction. It's adaptation, imperfect and still ongoing, the same way your body has always responded to loss, not by giving up on the job, just by doing it differently than before. Understanding that doesn't only satisfy curiosity, it changes what you actually listen for in your own body, and it turns a vague, frustrating mystery into something you can name, explain, and act on. So the next time something feels a little off after a meal, years after that surgery, you won't have to wonder if it's all in your head. You'll know exactly which drip, which tube, and which chain of cause and effect to go looking for.